December 1974. A Japanese soldier emerges from the Philippine jungle. He's wearing a tattered uniform, carrying a rifle that still works. His sword is polished to perfection. He snaps to attention and salutes. The war, he believes, has just ended. But World War II ended 29 years ago, for 3 decades. While the world moved on, while men walked on the moon, while Japan became an economic superpower, this man was hiding in the jungle, fighting, surviving, waiting. His name is Hiroo Onoda, and this is the story of the last Japanese soldier to surrender from World War II. Introduce the mystery. On the 10th of March, 1974, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda walked out of the jungle on Lubang Island in the Philippines. He was 52 years old. He'd been there since 1944. The world watched in disbelief as this soldier, who'd missed the atomic bombs, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the moon landing, and everything in between, finally came home. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. Onoda wasn't lost. He wasn't trapped. He wasn't hiding because he was afraid. He was following orders that told him to never surrender, orders that told him Japan would come back for him. And he believed those orders for 10,957 days. How does a human mind maintain a belief for 3 decades in the face of overwhelming evidence? How do you survive alone in a hostile jungle for 29 years? And what does it take to finally convince someone that their entire reality is wrong? To understand Hiroo Onoda's story, we need to go back to the beginning, back to 1922, when a boy was born in a small farming village in Japan, a boy who would grow up to become one of the most loyal and most tragic soldiers in history. Part 1. The Making of a Soldier. Hiroo Onoda was born on the 19th of March, 1922, in Kainan, Wakayama Prefecture, Japan. His family ran a small business, middle class, traditional, patriotic. Onoda grew up during a time when Japanese military culture was at its peak. The country was expanding its empire across Asia. Military service wasn't just expected, it was the highest honor. From childhood, Onoda absorbed the values of Bushido, the way of the warrior, loyalty, duty, honor, and above all, never surrender. Surrender meant shame, not just for you, but for your family, your ancestors, your entire lineage. In 1939, when Onoda was 17, Japan was already at war with China. But Onoda didn't join the military immediately. Instead, he went to work for a trading company in China, learning Chinese and gaining experience in commerce. But when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, everything changed. The Pacific War had begun. In 1942, at age 20, Onoda was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army. He started as an ordinary infantry soldier, but his intelligence, language skills, and dedication quickly caught the attention of his superiors. In 1944, Onoda was selected for an elite training program, the Nakano School. This wasn't ordinary military training. The Nakano School was Japan's intelligence academy, a secretive institution that trained officers in guerrilla warfare, sabotage, propaganda, and covert operations. These weren't frontline soldiers. They were intelligence operatives, trained to operate behind enemy lines, to survive independently, to gather information and disrupt enemy operations through unconventional means. The training was brutal. Students learned hand-to-hand combat, survival skills, how to live off the land, how to interrogate prisoners, how to create and detect propaganda, and most importantly, how to think independently while maintaining absolute loyalty to the emperor. One of the core principles drilled into Nakano students was this: never give up, never surrender, even if it means fighting alone for years. Instructors used real examples, stories of Japanese soldiers who'd held out on remote Pacific islands, continuing to fight long after their units were destroyed. This wasn't presented as tragedy, it was presented as the ideal. Onoda absorbed every lesson. By late 1944, Japan was losing the war badly. American forces were island hopping across the Pacific, reclaiming territory, pushing closer to the Japanese homeland. The Philippines, a crucial strategic position, was about to fall. In December 1944, two-year-old Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda received his orders. He was being deployed to Lubang Island in the Philippines. The mission: Lubang Island is small, only about 20 miles long and 9 miles wide. Mountainous, covered in dense jungle, home to a few thousand Filipino civilians who lived in small farming villages. It wasn't a major military target, but it had strategic value. Lubang sat along vital shipping lanes. If Japanese forces could hold it, they could disrupt American supply lines and gather intelligence on enemy movements. Onoda's mission was clear: lead guerrilla operations against enemy forces, destroy the pier and airfield to prevent enemy use, gather intelligence, survive as long as possible. Under no circumstances, surrender or take your own life. Before deploying, Onoda met with his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. Taniguchi looked at the young lieutenant and said something Onoda would never forget. "You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him. You may have to live on coconuts. If that's the case, live on coconuts. Under no circumstances are you to give up your life voluntarily." Onoda saluted. He understood. This wasn't a suicide mission. This was an intelligence operation. He was expected to survive, to endure, to wait for Japan's inevitable victory. On the 26th of December, 1944, Onoda arrived on Lubang Island with a small unit of soldiers. The situation was immediately chaotic. American and Filipino forces were already active on the island. Japanese defenses were crumbling. Within weeks, most of Onoda's unit was killed or scattered. By late February 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Lubang had collapsed. But Onoda and a handful of soldiers retreated into the mountains. They would wait for Japan to counterattack and retake the island. They would follow their orders. They had no idea that in 6 months, the war would be over. Part 2. The war ends, but not for them. On the 15th of August 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese nation via radio. In a voice most Japanese people had never heard before, the emperor announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The war was over. Across the Pacific, Japanese soldiers began laying down their weapons. Some committed suicide rather than face the shame of surrender. Others emerged from jungles and caves, malnourished and traumatized, grateful the nightmare had ended. But in the mountains of Lubang Island, 4 Japanese soldiers heard nothing. Hiroo Onoda, 23 years old, Private Yuichi Akatsu, a young conscript, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, mid-20s, Private First Class Kenshichi Kazuka, early 20s. These 4 men had survived the American invasion by hiding in the dense jungle interior. They'd built makeshift shelters. They lived on stolen food from local farms, rice, bananas, coconuts, occasionally livestock. They moved at night, hid during the day, avoided all contact with civilians and military patrols. In October 1945, 2 months after the war ended, they found their first leaflet. It was dropped from an airplane, fluttering down through the jungle canopy. The leaflet, printed in Japanese, read, "The war ended on August 15. Come down from the mountains." The 4 men gathered around, reading it carefully. Akatsu spoke first. "Maybe it's true. Maybe the war really is over." Onoda cut him off immediately. "It's enemy propaganda. Obviously, this is exactly what we were trained to expect." He explained his reasoning. The Americans knew Japanese soldiers were trained never to surrender. So they'd use psychological warfare. They'd create fake leaflets, claiming the war was over. They'd try to trick soldiers into giving up. It was a classic intelligence operation. The leaflet even had mistakes that proved it was fake. The phrasing was slightly off. The Japanese wasn't quite natural. To Onoda's trained eye, this was clearly written by American intelligence, trying to mimic Japanese military communication. What Onoda didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the leaflet was real, and those mistakes were just the result of hastily translated emergency communications. But his training had prepared him too well. He'd been taught to question everything, to assume the enemy would use deception, to trust only direct orders from his commanding officer. So the 4 men stayed in the jungle. More leaflets came, dozens of them over the following months. Each one was analyzed. Each one was determined to be fake. In 1946, search parties began entering the jungle. Philippine soldiers, American forces, even Japanese officials who'd stayed in the Philippines. They called out in Japanese. They left newspapers showing Japan's surrender. They left photos of Tokyo, devastated by American bombing. The 4 soldiers watched from hiding. To them, this was all part of the deception. Of course, the Americans would show photos of destruction. That's what propaganda does. It demoralizes the enemy. It makes you think your homeland is defeated when, really, it's regrouping, preparing for the next offensive. The newspapers? Clearly fabricated. The dates didn't make sense. The stories seemed designed to break their spirit. The Japanese officials calling out to them? Possibly prisoners of war, forced to cooperate, or traitors who turned against the emperor. Onoda's Nakano School training had given him a framework for interpreting everything he encountered. And that framework told him, trust nothing, wait for orders, Japan will return. But as the months turned into years, cracks began to form. Are you as stunned by this as I was when I first learned about it? If so, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe, because supporting the channel helps me bring you more unbelievable true stories like this one. The first defection. Private Yuichi Akatsu was the youngest, the least trained, the most vulnerable. He hadn't attended the Nakano School. He was just a regular conscript who'd ended up in this situation through bad luck. And he was breaking down. By 1949, 4 years after the war ended, the psychological strain was becoming unbearable. 4 men living in constant fear, constant hunger, constant paranoia. They couldn't light fires during the day because smoke would give away their position. They couldn't talk above a whisper. They slept in shifts, always watching for enemy patrols. Every rustling leaf was a potential threat. Every helicopter overhead was searching for them. Every farmer they saw was a possible enemy collaborator. Akatsu started questioning everything. What if the war really is over, he'd ask. What if we're wrong? What if Japan really did surrender? Onoda would shut him down immediately. That's exactly what they want you to think. That's how psychological warfare works. The moment you start doubting, they've won. But doubt, once planted, grows. In September 1950, 5 years after World War II ended, Akatsu made his decision. One night, while the others slept, he simply left. He walked down from the mountains and surrendered to Philippine authorities. When Onoda and the others woke up, Akatsu was gone. Shimada wanted to search for him. Maybe he'd been captured. Maybe they could rescue him. But Onoda stopped him. He deserted, Onoda said coldly. He broke. The enemy's propaganda worked on him. We continue the mission. Now there were 3, Onoda, Shimada, and Kazuka. But Akatsu's defection had proven something to Onoda. The enemy's psychological operations were sophisticated. They were effective. They'd broken one of his men. This meant Onoda had to be even more vigilant, even more resistant to doubt. He couldn't let the same thing happen to Shimada or Kazuka. So he doubled down on their routine. More discipline, more structure, more reminders of their duty to the emperor. They were soldiers of Japan. They had orders. They would wait. The 1950s passed. The Korean War happened. American forces deployed throughout Asia, but none of this reached the 3 men in the jungle. Search parties still came occasionally. Leaflets still fell from the sky. In 1952, letters from the soldiers' families were dropped into the jungle. Onoda found one addressed to him. It was from his mother and brothers. The letter begged him to come home. It described how Japan had changed, how the family missed him, how they wanted him to return safely. Onoda read it carefully. Then he declared it was a fake. The handwriting looked similar to his mother's, but not quite right. The phrasing was close, but something felt off. Obviously, American intelligence had captured letters from his family and forged new ones. Or they'd forced his family to write under duress. This was sophisticated, impressive, even, but it wouldn't work. Kazuka asked the obvious question, what if it's real? Onoda's response was firm. If it's real, why doesn't our commanding officer come in person and order us to stand down? Why all these tricks? Why these anonymous leaflets and suspicious letters? It was a fair point. If Japan really wanted them to surrender, why not send Major Taniguchi? Why not send someone they'd recognize and trust with official orders? The fact that this hadn't happened proved, in Onoda's mind, that Japan was still at war, and these were enemy psychological operations. What Onoda didn't know was that the Japanese government had tried to contact them directly multiple times, but the soldiers were so well hidden and so determined to avoid contact that every attempt failed. The years continued to pass. 1953, 1954, 1955. The world beyond Lubang Island was transforming at an incredible pace. What happened next shocked everyone. But before that, let's pause and understand what was happening in the world these men were missing. Part 3. The world moves on. While Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka lived in their jungle reality, the real world was changing at breakneck speed. By the mid-1950s, Japan was in the midst of an economic miracle. The country America had devastated with atomic bombs was rebuilding. With American aid through the Marshall Plan and the economic boom from the Korean War, Japan was transforming from a defeated empire into a modern industrial power. Tokyo was rising from the ashes. Skyscrapers were going up. Factories were producing cars, electronics, textile. The emperor, the divine figure Onoda had pledged his life to serve, had publicly renounced his divinity in 1946. He was now a constitutional monarch, a symbolic figurehead in a democratic government. The military culture that had defined Japanese society was gone. Article 9 of the new constitution prohibited Japan from maintaining offensive military forces. Everything Onoda had been trained to fight for had fundamentally changed, but he knew none of this. In his reality, it was still 1944. The war was still happening. Japan was still fighting. Meanwhile, the Philippines had gained full independence from the United States in 1946. Lubang Island was now part of a sovereign nation. No longer a battlefield, but a peaceful rural area. The farmers the soldiers stole from weren't enemy collaborators. They were Filipino civilians trying to make a living. But Onoda and his men saw everyone as a potential threat. In 1954, 9 years after the war ended, tragedy struck. Corporal Shimada was shot and killed during a firefight with Philippine police. The police had been searching for the bandits who'd been raiding farms and stealing livestock for years. When they encountered armed men in the jungle, they opened fire. Shimada died instantly. Now there were two. Just Onoda and Kozuka. Two men in the jungle, still fighting, still believing. Kozuka was devastated, but Onoda wouldn't let him break. Shimada died serving the emperor, Onoda said. He died a soldier's death. We honor him by continuing the mission. So they continued. Two men maintaining a war that existed only in their minds. They developed an elaborate routine to maintain discipline and structure. Every morning, formal inspection of weapons and equipment, regular reconnaissance missions to monitor enemy movements, strict rationing of stolen food supplies, maintaining their uniforms as best they could, keeping a detailed journal of observation. Onoda kept notes on everything he saw. Troop movements, farmers going to market, supply convoys, delivery trucks, enemy fortifications, new houses being built. To an outside observer, it would seem like madness. But inside Onoda's framework, it all made perfect sense. He was a Japanese intelligence officer doing exactly what he'd been trained to do: survive behind enemy lines, gather intelligence, wait for extraction. The 1960s arrived. The world was exploding with change. The space race was happening. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. In 1969, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. The Vietnam War was raging. American forces were fighting in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, where they maintained military bases. The Beatles conquered the world. Television became ubiquitous. Computers started entering universities and research labs. Japan hosted the 1964 Summer Olympics in Tokyo, a global coming-out party for the rebuilt nation. The economic miracle continued. By the late 1960s, Japan had the second-largest economy in the world. None of this reached Lubang Island. Well, that's not quite true. Onoda and Kozuka did notice changes. They saw helicopters overhead, different models than the ones from the war, more advanced. They saw transistor radios in the hands of farmers. They saw new types of clothing, new tools, new technology. But they interpreted all of it through their wartime lens. The new technology? Obviously, the war had been going on so long that military equipment had advanced. The changed clothing styles? Cultural changes happen even during wartime. The apparent peace on the island? A temporary occupation period. Japan would counterattack eventually. Every piece of evidence that contradicted their worldview was reinterpreted to fit within it. This is what psychologists call confirmation bias taken to an extreme. But it's more than that. Onoda had created an entire system of meaning. His identity, his purpose, his sense of honor, everything rested on the belief that he was still a soldier following orders. To accept that the war was over would mean accepting that he'd wasted 20-plus years of his life. His comrades had died for nothing. He'd become exactly what he was trained to never be. A soldier who gave up everything he believed about duty and honor was wrong. The psychological cost of that realization would be devastating, so his mind found ways to reject it. In 1972, another catastrophe. Onoda and Kozuka were conducting a reconnaissance mission near a coastal village. They were observed by Philippine police, who called for backup. In the ensuing firefight, Kozuka was shot and killed. Hiroo Onoda was now completely alone. He was 50 years old. He'd been in the jungle for 27 years, and now, for the first time since 1944, he had no one. Part 4. Alone. The solitude was crushing. For nearly 3 decades, Onoda had at least had companions, other men who shared his reality, who confirmed his beliefs, who validated his mission. Now there was no one. Just Onoda, the jungle, and his thoughts. He buried Kozuka with full military honors, saluted his grave, said a prayer for his soul. Then he returned to his shelter and continued the mission, because what else could he do? Onoda's daily routine became almost meditative. Wake before dawn, clean his rifle, a Type 99 that still functioned after nearly 30 years, polish his sword, inspect his uniform, conduct reconnaissance, watch the villages, take notes on enemy activities, steal food when necessary, return to his shelter before dawn. At night, he'd read and reread the leaflets he'd collected over the years. He'd analyze them for clues, try to figure out what the enemy's strategy was. He thought about his family, wondered if they were still alive, wondered if Japan had won the war yet, wondered when his orders to return would come. He thought about Kozuka and Shimada and Akatsu. He was lonely, desperately lonely, but he was also determined. After Kozuka's death, search efforts intensified. The Philippine government, embarrassed that a Japanese soldier was still hiding on the island nearly 30 years after the war, mounted serious search operations. Japanese officials came, former soldiers who'd served with Onoda, his own family members. They brought photos, documents, personal items from his childhood. They used loudspeakers to broadcast messages in Japanese. Onoda-san, the war is over. Your family is waiting. Please come home. Onoda heard all of it, and he didn't believe any of it. The photos looked fake. The documents seemed forged. Even if those were his family members, they could be under duress, forced to cooperate with the enemy. His Nakano School training had prepared him too well. By the early 1970s, Onoda had become an international legend. News stories circulated about the Japanese soldier who won't surrender. Documentaries were made, books were written. Some people in Japan saw him as a hero, the ultimate example of loyalty and dedication. Others saw him as a tragedy, a man whose life had been destroyed by fanatical military indoctrination. But to Hiroo Onoda, hiding in his jungle shelter, none of this existed. He was simply a soldier, following orders, waiting. Then, in 1974, something changed. A young Japanese man named Norio Suzuki was about to do what decades of official search parties couldn't. He was about to find Hiroo Onoda, and what happened next would shock the world. Part 5. The Encounter. Norio Suzuki was 24 years old, a college dropout, a wanderer, an adventurer. He had a list of things he wanted to do before he died. Find Lieutenant Onoda, find a panda, find the abominable snowman. He wasn't military, wasn't a government official. He was just a young guy with a backpack and a camera who thought finding a legendary holdout soldier would be cool. In February 1974, Suzuki arrived on Lubang Island. He didn't bring weapons, didn't bring a search team, just camping gear and determination. He simply walked into the jungle and started looking. For days, he saw nothing. Then, on the 20th of February 1974, it happened. Suzuki was sitting by his campfire at night when he heard movement in the trees. He looked up. A man emerged from the shadows, thin, weather-beaten, holding a rifle. He was wearing a tattered Japanese Imperial Army uniform. Suzuki's heart was pounding, but he didn't run. He smiled and called out in Japanese, "Onoda-san?" The man froze. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Suzuki did something brilliant. He started speaking casually, like they were old friends. "I'm from Japan. I'm not military. I'm not here to capture you. I just wanted to meet you. Everyone in Japan knows your name. You're famous." Onoda kept his rifle pointed at Suzuki, but he didn't fire. Suzuki continued talking about Japan, about the modern world, about how the war ended in 1945. Onoda listened but remained skeptical. Then Suzuki showed him something. Photographs. Photos of modern Tokyo. Skyscrapers. Bullet trains. The 1964 Olympics. Photos of Japan's economic boom. Cars. Electronics. Department stores. Onoda examined them carefully. They looked real, but he'd seen fake photos before. This could still be propaganda. Suzuki then showed him newspapers. Recent ones. From 1974. Headlines about Nixon and Watergate. About the oil crisis. About Japan's contemporary politics. Onoda read them, his trained intelligence officer's mind analyzing every detail. The dates, the events, the language. If this was fake, it was extraordinarily sophisticated. But still, even if the war is over, Onoda said slowly, I cannot surrender unless I receive a direct order from my commanding officer. This was the key. All the leaflets, all the search parties, all the messages over the years, none of them had included the one thing Onoda needed, a direct order from Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. Suzuki understood. What if I could bring your commanding officer here? What if he ordered you to stand down? Onoda was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. If Major Taniguchi orders me to surrender, I will obey. Suzuki left the jungle the next day and flew back to Japan. He went directly to the media. The story exploded. Onoda found, demands orders from commanding officer to surrender. The government swung into action. They located Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. He was 74 years old now, a retired bookseller living in Fukuoka. He hadn't worn a uniform in 30 years, hadn't given military orders since 1945. But when he heard that his former subordinate was still in the jungle, still waiting for orders, still following the mission he'd assigned him in 1944, Taniguchi wept. I'll go, he said. I'll bring him home. Part 6. The Surrender, the 9th of March, 1974. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, wearing his old Imperial Japanese Army uniform, walked into the jungle on Lubang Island. With him were Japanese officials, Philippine government representatives, and journalists. They reached a predetermined location and waited. Taniguchi called out, Lieutenant Onoda, this is Major Taniguchi. I order you to appear. From the trees, Hiroo Onoda emerged. He was 52 years old. His uniform was patched and faded but clean. His rifle was functional. His sword gleamed. He walked toward Taniguchi with perfect military bearing. When he reached his former commanding officer, Onoda snapped to attention and saluted. Taniguchi returned the salute. For a moment, neither man spoke. 30 years of history hung between them. Then Taniguchi read the orders. In accordance with the imperial command, The 14th Area Army has ceased all combat activity. You are hereby relieved of all military duties. You are ordered to cease military activities immediately and place yourself under the command of the nearest superior officer. Lieutenant Onoda, I order you to lay down your arms. Onoda stood perfectly still. Then, slowly, he removed his rifle from his shoulder. He removed his sword from his belt. He placed them both on the ground. He reached into his pack and removed several items. His Type 99 rifle, still in working order, 500 rounds of ammunition, several hand grenades, his officer's sword, maintained and polished for 30 years, his military orders from 1944, kept in a waterproof case. He laid each item out carefully, precisely, as if preparing for a formal inspection. Then he presented them to Major Taniguchi. Taniguchi accepted them with tears streaming down his face. Your mission is complete, Lieutenant. Well done. You may go home now. Onoda saluted one final time. The war, his war, was finally over. After 29 years and 3 months, the last Japanese soldier to surrender from World War II had finally laid down his arms. Aftermath. Hiroo Onoda returned to Japan as a celebrity. Some called him a hero. Others called him a relic, a symbol of a militaristic past Japan had tried to leave behind. Onoda struggled to adapt. The Japan he returned to was utterly foreign. The values that had defined his life, absolute loyalty, military honor, sacrifice for the emperor, had been replaced by democracy, capitalism, and pacifism. He felt like a man out of time. In 1975, he moved to Brazil, where he started a cattle ranch and lived quietly for decades. He married, wrote a memoir, gave occasional interviews. He returned to Lubang Island multiple times, donating money to local schools and trying to make peace with the community he'd terrorized for 30 years. In his later years, Onoda ran a nature school in Japan, teaching young people survival skills and self-discipline. He never expressed regret for following his orders, but he acknowledged the cost. I became an officer of the Imperial Japanese Army in order to die for His Majesty the Emperor, he said in an interview. Instead, I survived for him. Hiroo Onoda died on the 16th of January 2014 at the age of 91. His story raises profound questions about loyalty, duty, identity, and the power of belief. Was he a hero? A victim? A fanatic? A man of principle? Could you have survived alone for 30 years? Would you have believed the war was over? And what really kept him there, duty to his country, or the inability to face what accepting the truth would mean? History doesn't give us easy answers, but it gives us stories. And the story of Hiroo Onoda, the soldier who refused to surrender, is one we won't forget. What do you think? Was Onoda a hero or a victim? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more incredible true stories from history, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching.